Well, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gary Baldwin. I am the Director of Special Projects for Energy and Environment at CITRIS and the I4Energy Center. Welcome, and welcome to our web viewers, especially from our sister campuses at UC Davis, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz, and to everyone else that's watching on the web. Before we begin today's event, let me announce that next Tuesday, the 17th of November, at 2 p.m. in this auditorium, there will be a lecture by Dr. Eric Horvitz, the Principal Researcher and Research Area Manager of Microsoft Research, on the topic of learning, reasoning, and intelligence in the open world. It should be a very interesting lecture, and I think that there are copies of this flyer on the table in the back. If not, they'll be on the CITRIS website. Let me also thank the California Institute for Energy and Environment for providing the lunches for today, as always. So thank you all, Carl and Gaiman, for your great contribution to this successful event. Today is a very special day for the I4Energy series because a good friend of mine and a good friend of CITRIS and I4Energy is going to be talking to us about events leading up to and issues involved with the meeting of the United Nations that will take place in Copenhagen in December. This is obviously a very important international global event with many, many important decisions that could be made. We are very privileged to have Niels Nielsen with us today speaking on this topic. Niels is going to do something a little different. He's not going to use any slides, so if those of you viewing this on the web don't see anything in the slide panel on your screen, that's by design. Niels is not only a good friend of CITRIS and of many of us who've known him for some years now, he is chairman and CEO of Qnet. He's a non-executive director of a number of companies, including Codan, Monday Morning, Profit, and Development Alternatives. During the 1990s, he was a key member of the team that created the Danish Institute of Technology through a sequence of mergers and acquisitions and took that company through a significant turnaround toward its present status of one of the larger and more profitable companies in the technology sector in Europe. He was behind the creation of the Danish government's learning laboratory. Before conceiving Q, Niels created Qnet, a global network of specialist consulting firms. He is an adjunct professor at the Copenhagen Business School and is a visiting scholar here at UC Berkeley. Niels, it's wonderful to have you here today speaking on this topic. Let's give Niels a nice warm welcome, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, all of you, for coming here. It's a pleasure for me to talk about this topic, particularly here at Berkeley and within the framework of CITRIS, because in the process of creating momentum for the COP-15 in Copenhagen next month, there have been many very substantial and very impactful contributions by people from CITRIS and people from the UC system. We had a very, very successful conference last year in Copenhagen, co-sponsored between Copenhagen Climate Council, which I'm deeply involved in, and CITRIS. And I think it's fair to say that bringing the many different disciplines of climate change mitigation research into focus and bringing it much more to the attention of also the political decision makers in this process was brought to a whole new level at that conference, and that's very much thanks to this place and Gary personally. So for me, it feels like coming home to some of the friends in the process to be able to speak here. All that said, I could also make my speech really short, because yesterday it was finally publicly recognized by the Obama administration's negotiations team that the U.S. is not going to be ready to enter a treaty in Copenhagen. The wording was somewhat mysterious. It said there won't be a treaty, we won't be ready for a treaty, but we can make an intermediary something. And no one knows what that intermediary something is. I actually had the chance to check up with people who are involved in the Danish negotiation team and who are hosting this thing, and they don't know what it means. So it's probably a fact that there won't be a treaty next month. So much ado for nothing could be one way of talking about it. There will be the heads of states of 190 countries in the world there. There have been years and years and years of preparatory negotiations, diplomatic channels, contributions by companies, NGOs, researchers, etc. But there won't be a treaty. On the other hand, there are a lot of things to say, both about the process and about what is coming out of it. And I'm actually, in spite of what I've just said, I have become one of the optimists who actually believe that not because of the meeting, not because of negotiations, but because of the process, we will see significant global progress towards mitigating climate change. And we are actually seeing it right now. So let me share with you some of my reasons for optimism. And let me start by taking you to Turkey. Actually, I want to take you to southeast Turkey, the province of southeast Anatolia, which historically 5,000 years ago was the cradle of urbanized human civilization. It was also the locus for the first man-created ecological catastrophe, which means most of the land in that region has not been cultivated for 4,500 years. So you could call it almost virgin. The region is one of the crossroads of history. You almost can't mention one of the big conquering armies and moves that moved through the world that did not come through there, from Alexander to Genghis Khan. The Silk Road goes through the area. And today it is a place that is blessed by very good neighbors, since the region borders to Iran and Iraq. It is also a place that is, in a funny way, caught in the middle, because compared to all of Turkey, they are very poor. Compared to the really poor in the world, like Bangladesh, or some parts of Vietnam, or places like that, their cost level and standard of living is way too high. So they are poor related to their immediate surroundings, but they can't compete internationally based on cost, because for that they're way too expensive. Why am I talking about that region now? The cradle of civilization, a poor region, a conflict-prone region with all the ethnic conflicts you can almost think of, Kurds and Turks and Sumerians and Georgians and Armenians and in the same place. The reason I'm talking about that region is southeast Anatolia now is in the process of becoming the first 100% renewable energy region of that size in the world. Part of the reason they can do it is that for military reasons, the Turkish government invested 35 billion euro in hydropower in the region. Not to get the power really, but to control the water. So by controlling the water, they could control those difficult neighbors called Saddam Hussein and things like that. So the region has enormous amounts of hydropower. They don't use it in the region very much because they don't have a grid yet. So the electricity is used up north in the industrialized Turkey, but they have that power. They've then decided to say, we'll supplement this hydroelectricity with ambitious investments in wind, solar, and geothermal. And they've decided to make that a growth proposition, a growth strategy for the region. And the way they've decided to do that is they go to not the big mega, for example, wind turbine producers like Vestas, but they go to the smaller, new, alternative design wind turbine producers, and say, if we buy the first 200 of your turbines, will you place some of the production of those in our region? If we deploy them, the interesting thing is some of these new generation turbines are the interesting mid-size, sort of 500 to 750 kilowatt turbines that are just perfect for a village, and you don't have the grid problem. They are, by the way, very much easier to install. It doesn't take the huge cranes and so on, so they can be installed on hilltops and locally. Many of them have designs that generate less turbulence and therefore less noise, so they can be placed close to the villages. They're also saying solar. We actually already have decided that all this water we have in our hydroelectricity plants, we already have decided that some of that can be used to irrigate all our virgin land. 14 million acres of virgin land is going to be irrigated. So of course, instead of using conventional, fairly brutal irrigation technologies, what they do is they do drip irrigation. And of course, the pumps to be used for that will be solar powered. When you go to a pump manufacturer and say, we are in the process of buying pumps, solar powered pumps enough for 14 million acres, and don't hold me up on that, because it's either 14 million acres or 14 million hectares. And I know that in terms of land is a big difference, but I can't remember which of it is. It's a lot of land. They go to the manufacturer of these pumps and say, we want, by the way, to manufacture the pumps in the region. They need a lot of air conditioning. They don't have the power for it. Actually a US company here in California has developed a solar-powered new generation air conditioning technology. Same story, it'll be produced there. They've gone to the big manufacturers and the big clothing companies who now have an increasing number of products on the market that are based on organically grown cotton and other textiles. This region is great for cotton. So they made the deal, if we not only grow the cotton organically, but every consumption of power linked to the production will be renewable energy. So it'll be sustainable, and we do better practices in the production process. Will you source more of your cotton from us? And companies like Gap have said yes, Levi's, Nike, Patagonia, North Face, what they are all called. I could go on with this, but the bottom line of it is a government no one would have thought about in this context of the climate change negotiations has decided, they've decided that we will take our poorest region, we'll make an ambitious growth scenario for the region in terms of economic and material and energy consumption growth. But we'll do it 100% renewable, And we can do it in ways so the very fact that we say renewable is what generates the economic growth. The fact that this is happening, and it's actually happening, three of the 5 members of the international expert team that is advising the Turkish government on this strategy are faculty here at Berkeley. Berkeley is deeply involved in this. But why do I spend this much time talking about that in relation to a diplomatic process of negotiating mitigation for climate change and a new treaty? Answer should be fairly obvious, but let's move into it. The core of all the disagreements in the climate change mitigation negotiations is the debate about convergence. Any person who lives in the US spends 5x the amount of energy and slightly more than 5x the carbon emission level of any person living in China. Should the Chinese cut their growth, or should the US cut its consumption? All the disagreements are basically about that one question. And it takes all the different forms and shapes and so on, but it is that one question. What is Southeast Anatolia proving in this process? They're basically saying we can have growth, we can achieve wealth without needing to increase our climate impact. Actually, we can have growth and wealth and lower our climate impact at the same time. Hugely important. And one of the things that are there to be part of breaking the deadlocks in the negotiations. And I think and hope that one of the things that will be in that mysterious interim treaty or interim agreement that the US government is now pointing towards will be provisions to co-finance efforts like the one the Turkish government is doing in Southeast Anatolia. This can be rolled out widely. They can't all do the same. And it's clear if the Turks, as first movers, decide that they are able to produce the wind turbines that will be used also in Iraq and Iran and other places, then they can't produce them as well. And they can try to, but someone will win and someone will lose in that game. But that's the first reason for my optimism, even though there won't be a treaty, is that out of this process, there are first movers who've decided to do things like the Turks. Similar things are going on in Patagonia, in Chile and Argentina. Similar things are going on in some of the Pacific nation states. Similar things are going on in more developed economies. But this whole effort changes the negotiation game from a zero-sum game where we're discussing who takes the pain and who pays into a much more interesting game that is an innovation and investment and growth game. Very, very important. And I can't tell you how much the efforts of the Turkish government in that thing changed some of the tonality in the talks. So, that was my first reason for optimism. My second reason for optimism is what has happened with the corporate players. Over the last just 2 weeks, you've seen 2 CEOs of 2 of the largest corporations in the world the big global conglomerates that do all the heavy stuff. The CEO of Siemens and the CEO of GE have both come out and said, as CEOs of global corporations, we cannot live with uncertainty in this area. We need clarification, and we need a set of rules for the game we are playing as businesses that will allow us to do long-term planning. And the long-term planning cannot be done under ongoing uncertainty about what will the terms be. And by the way, we cannot plan long-term for GE. Mr. Immel, cannot plan long-term for GE without also a fairly high level of certainty. Not only that the rules are stable, but much more important, that we won't have catastrophic climate impact events. It's become, I sit on 12 boards. One of them is a big publicly listed insurance company. We never, for the last 3 years, we haven't had a board meeting without discussing the risk impact of climate change. Imagine the nightmare for an insurance company of not knowing what happens in terms of climate change. It's huge. Therefore, in this process over the last 3, 4, 5 years, where the run-up to the COP-15 and Al Gore's wonderful PR work and all the other things that have happened, in this run-up over the last 4 or 5 years, what we've seen is, number one, climate change have moved onto the agenda of corporate boards. And number two, they moved onto the agenda of corporate boards first as, actually it's been an interesting story. When it first started to come onto the agenda of corporate boards, it was a PR and damage control and sometimes corporate social responsibility type of discussion. The first progress was, in the old days, we sent our industry lobbyists to Washington and made sure there would be no regulation. Then we became aware that if we are part of the problem and people are beginning to think about climate change this way, then we'd better discuss how we avoid to be too embarrassed in the process. A symptom of that, a beautiful formulation of that was Jim Rogers, the CEO of Duke Energy. He started going out publicly and saying climate change is a problem, we need to do something about it. His board called him to order and said, why are you out there saying this? That's the lefties and the Greenpeace people and their line. What are you doing? And he said, I can explain it to you very simply why I have to be talking about it. By giving you 3 numbers, 3, 12, and 42. And his board looked at him and he said, what is this all about? And he said, 3, out of all companies in the US, the carbon footprint of Duke Energy is number 3. 12, out of all companies in the world, the carbon footprint of Duke Energy is number 12. And 43, if Duke Energy was a nation, out of all nations in the world, we would be number 43 in terms of carbon footprint. So our choice is very simple as Duke Energy. Either we will be seen as a very, very big part of the problem, or we'd better become part of the solution. And that's why Duke Energy so much have changed their strategies and decided to leave the chambers of commerce, because the Chambers of Commerce didn't want, lobbied against the treaty and so on. And this has not happened in 1 or 2 or 3 companies. It's happening across the board. Next step in this change of how corporations see it is a lot of them have said, we'd better do something about climate change and lobby the other way for politicians to start coming up with solutions, because we can't live with the effects of climate change as our in our long-term risk profile. It's impossible to run a profitable business if we do not have that kind of risk under a certain level of control. So that was sort of the next level. And the third and the final corporate change that we've seen more and more the last year is the CEOs all of a sudden see climate mitigation and solutions to climate change as a strategic opportunity, an innovation opportunity, and a possibility for making new kinds of business, new kinds of products, new kinds of services. So we've seen this shift from let our lobbyists make sure that the politicians don't come up with new regulation, and then across this spectrum into corporate social responsibility, and then into we'd better become part of the solution, and then all the way over to let's mitigate the risk for our business, not the risk for the world, but the risk for our business, and finally, let's build the strategy so that we actually make money, build our future business by building the solutions to this. And it's not just 4 years ago, the CEOs who were ready to do something about this and talk about it even were sort of your unusual, very well-off, odd man out. It was Richard Branson. It was the Google boys. It was something you found among the odd CEOs. Today, it's across the board. It's Walmart, it's IBM, it's Cisco and Intel, it's GE, it's Siemens, it's of course very many of the utilities, it's many of the BP, Shell are both early movers in this, and you can go on and on and on. It's gone from the odd man out to corporate mainstream. So that's my second reason for optimism. But the very fact that the process is there has meant, number one, that there are nations who prove that they can grow without needing to go up to convergence levels of impact. And number two, there is not the odd company out, but there's a massive movement among corporations and by CEOs saying we can only do business, but we can do very good business if we take care of these problems and think them in as part of our strategy, our technologies, and our business models. A funny part of, just as an example of how big an effect this can have. You've all heard about the company Better Place, the electrical car infrastructure company that are now operating in Israel and preparing to operate a whole number of places across the world. In my little home country, Denmark, which will be the second full-scale pilot thing next to Israel for Better Place, you get an incredible equation on the economy of changing to electrical cars. Because since batteries can be recharged at night, every single moving vehicle on all the roads of Denmark can be powered 100% by the today non-utilized nighttime production capacity of the existing installed base of wind turbines in the country. Don't have to build a single wind turbine more. Just takes those that are already in place. And we could convert all cars on all our roads, including lorries and buses and so on, to electrical and run the whole thing without spending a dime on imported energy. An amazing equation. It's equivalent to the country finding a major oil field out somewhere in the North Sea and the national economic effect of that. And then we get the positive climate impact on top of that. The national economy of that was so attractive that the Minister of Finance even agreed to not tax these cars too much because getting them on board would long-term give enormous advantages to the national economy. China. Here comes my third reason for optimism, and at the same time, my big reason for pessimism on behalf of the US. China's way of taking part in the negotiations up to the treaty that won't be in Copenhagen has been a brilliant piece of diplomacy. They have played one card that is, we are in solidarity with all the other developing countries. They've added to that the second card saying, and we four big developing elephants, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, we are in the same boat. And they've been able to harness those two sets of voices in their case. Then they've said, we are definitely going to limit and optimize our use of energy and work on our climate impact. But we are not going to commit to anything before those who created the problem and who still use 5x what we do per capita before they've made concessions. Of the 190 countries that will be in Copenhagen, at least 170 agree with China on that position, that they need to see the US and the wealthy EU countries move first and come up with money. Fighting that position is an almost impossible battle to win, both morally, publicly, and politically. China has, however, at the same time done two other things, which they don't put into the negotiations. By doing these first things I mentioned, they put the US particularly, and next to the US, the EU, in a very uncomfortable defensive position. At the same time, they've said, almost like the Turkish government, but by the way, everywhere where we have to invest anyway, and everywhere where we can influence our own behavior by regulation, we might as well do it on the basis of a recognition that climate change is real, and we'd better do something about it. So they are playing one game diplomatically, where they are sitting back and putting the onus of action on the EU and the US. And then they are at the same time very, very aggressively and proactively in terms of regulation, planning, investments, going for the next generation solutions. I had the opportunity to speak in front of a group of very, very senior Chinese officials who are all involved in this process. And after I've spoken to them over dinner, we had a chance to have these discussions more in depth. And in their minds, there is absolutely no doubt that they will own batteries, that they will own many parts of solar, that they will be leaders and dominant in electrical car and transportation. They are already very, very rapidly becoming a very serious player in wind. They are very, very rapidly, different places in the country, making investments in what we now have gotten used to calling smart grid. And they intend to, in all these areas of green tech, to become, for that industry, at least as dominant as the combination of US and Japan has been for IT. They should not be able to, in any simple way, win this game. But the country that should make it impossible for them to win the game is playing its own hand clearly to become a loser. And I'm talking about my second home country, the US. The US is presently losing the innovation battle on all things green tech. In spite of the wonderful research here at Berkeley, all the energy in the valley and so on, the US is losing that battle. There's no leadership in a single of the key technologies yet here. And investments levels and the development of demand just does not keep pace. And every day that Congress plays its silly games and avoids getting its act together and defining a clear and proactive US policy in these areas, every day that goes on, US leadership and innovation and American jobs walk away. And the point where that loss of innovation edge and jobs, the point where that is irreversible is getting closer. I'm old enough to have seen how Europe lost the IT race to the US. And this, what's happening right now, gives me so many pattern recognition experiences that what's happening between China and the US now looks so much like that, only with the US in the EU role and China in the US role. It's disturbing in terms of security, in terms of global balance, and in terms of future wealth in this country. It's dangerous. So that's a funny kind of optimism, this last one, isn't it? I'm optimistic for the world's capability of doing something about climate change and mitigating the negative effects of climate change because of the many countries that have decided to build their growth and their strategies on green choices. I'm optimistic because of the landslide bandwagon move of corporations in a direction where they, for good, sound business reasons, do the right things. And I'm optimistic because China actually has decided it wants to win in this domain. That just has the negative side effect that since the US is not playing the game, I see the US as a loser in that play. pushing it out to questions. I know I've gone sort of roundabout ways by saying very briefly, one of the concerns around what's happening right now is that in terms of public opinion, there's no doubt that the global financial economic crisis has taken a lot of focus and attention away from climate change. There's also no doubt that the climate crisis and the financial and economic crisis are not the only crises that determine how we can deal with these things or not. There is an equally urgent global water crisis. We actually do have a very disturbing global security picture. While a lot of the world has become wealthier and still after the financial crisis is doing in many ways pretty well, there is still a number of countries and islands of population, even in the wealthy countries, that belong to what someone labeled the bottom billion. People and countries and economies who see no positive economic growth at all, even over 40, 50 years. We have a global health crisis with dysfunctional health systems everywhere in the world and more pandemic and epidemic types of disease profiles. And none of these crises, the climate crisis, the financial crisis, the health crisis, the security crisis, the poverty crisis, the food crisis, the water crisis, none of them can be solved without solving the others. Climate and health and food will make security worse. If we don't deal with the climate crisis, the financial crisis will keep getting worse. If we don't deal, well, I could go on and on. Let me finish just by saying the interesting challenge for us is the world is faced with all these crises. They are each of them severe enough that they could bring us almost to the point of, instead of doing something about it, as Shankar always says, instead of doing something about it, we would go home and drink red wine and hope to spend a few years in oblivion before going into real oblivion. However, the positive thing that I take out of what has happened while the diplomatic process has worked its way and not worked its way and stalled and moved forward and sputtered and jumped and run, the positive thing I take away from this is the very process of trying to deal with one of these crises has actually in itself mustered the kinds of forces that it takes to solve it in an innovation and growth and positive way. And I think the inspiration you can take from that is we can truly solve both the financial crisis and the poverty crisis by dealing with the water, the health, and the climate crisis. And if we do that well, I'm optimistic enough to believe that that would also help us dismantle the security, the grave security picture that we all have to cope with. So, out of a failed diplomatic process comes optimism and hope, at least for the world, but there will be losers and there will be winners in it. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Niels. Let me ask if you will take some questions and,
Absolutely.
and ask people if they do have questions or comments to make. We also have the web open, so if there are people watching that want to send in a comment or a question, we can filter that in as well. Yes, this gentleman.
I wanted to ask if what you're saying is true, the businessmen are jumping on the green tech wagon. How do you explain the attitude of the government then? Why did they say no treaty?
It's funny because the voice of business has very, very, very much changed the way politicians, particularly in Europe, talk about these problems and deal with them. There's been a dramatic shift in how European politicians discuss this and approach it and look at their need to come up with a solution. I think here in the US, number one, the awareness is much lower. Number two, big business does not have the kind of voice it used to have. Number three, the fact that a new administration has had to spend almost all its permission to push and shove on the financial crisis and the health system overhaul, means that there's very little energy, and that means sub-optimizations as in my state is a cold state, or as in if we move. I mean, many very sophisticated American politicians are stupid in the sense that they don't understand the global economic impact of who are first movers on some of these things. They do the short-term equation. If we do something about this, there will be a higher cost level on this or that or that. The energy bill for my constituency will be higher, and therefore it should not be done.
Other questions or comments? Do we have anything from the web coming in?
On the Danish case and A Better Place, electric cars, you said that they could refuel themselves entirely at night on the production of the wind system. Are you referring to nighttime wind with no storage element at all?
Well, the car batteries actually become the storage.
But no storage in the grid to
No.
refuel the entire fleet with nighttime wind?
Yeah.
That's indeed remarkable.
Pardon?
That's indeed remarkable.
Yeah, it is.
Other questions or comments?
There's one down there.
Coming.
Do you have any faith in the reform CDM later on? Or, start over. Do you have any faith in the flexible mechanisms right now? And do you have any predictions of what it would look like post-2012?
I couldn't hear
the flexible mechanisms like joint implementation, CDM, emissions trading, these market-based incentives. ETS.
I do. I think they contribute. I think they have been part of also creating the landslide, the bandwagon effect among corporate. I mean, there are market-driven mechanisms that do. I would like personally to see a very ambitious global cap and trade mechanism in place, and I think we'll need something like that. But that's sort of at a different end of the spectrum.
Just curious, you just mentioned that the U.S. is kind of losing the game of the energy, addressing the energy crisis. What's your comment on the the U.S. Advantage in its scientific research in both the new energy solutions and such like biofuels and solar cell, these things?
I think it's great that there are big investments in this research. It's also one of the hopes. It's one of the reasons why the lagging is not yet irreversible. I think the increase in the investments are very promising. The reason why I don't think it's enough is that for the research to be effectively converted into innovation and economic competitiveness, there needs to be the demand side of the equation as well. That's one of the reasons I have this déjà vu thinking about the IT race between the EU and the US, because in many different ways, demand was stimulated and allowed to evolve in the US, whereas in a funny way in the EU, there was equally much research money available, but one of the ways that the money for that research was raised in one of the most stupid innovation programs ever implemented by the EU. That was actually when it was still the EC. Was that by putting tariffs and taxes on sold IT, they raised the money that was used to finance the IT research, which meant they slowed the growth of the market and the growth of use, and thought they could compensate for that by doing top-down research. And so in a funny way, what happens in the US right now looks like that picture back in the IT race many, many years ago.
What do you see about the U.S. adopting a strategy where it takes the highest tech things, nanosensors, materials, algorithms, tools, and essentially sells them to the medium tech people, which would be like the BRIC countries, and then there'd be low-tech people below that. But essentially, since the U.S. is about 5% of the population of the world, it could have very high standard of living, but just providing the highest technology, materials, and systems for everybody else to use.
My problem with that strategy is that so much of making this into solutions with high value add will sit with whoever becomes the integrator. And doing just the high end and having a weak development of demand will not allow the U.S. companies to dominate the system integration side of it.
Unless the U.S. is the integrator, it's providing integration tools.
Yeah, but I don't think that'll happen.
Two more over here, and then that probably will.
Unless other things are done differently.
Carl, you?
You said some hopeful things about what China is doing, but I understand that half of the buildings going up today in the world are going up in China. I don't think they're very good buildings yet, probably. And I think they're still building coal plants. So what's the path to turn that around?
Well, the path to turning it around is that the sheer volume of everything that happens in China is so great. And I totally agree with you that, yes, they are still building coal plants. They're also putting a lot of money, and probably by now, or even jointly with the US, a lot of effort into improving on the coal technologies. A lot of their buildings are terrible, even the new ones they built right now. But a sufficient percentage of them, both the buildings and their energy generation investments, etc., actually are very advanced and very, very good. And the way they see it is they can't convert everything from the start. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the capability, but they convert enough of it to new standards and new technologies so that they learn and so that they have the demand pull that can help direct their research push.
You mentioned a number of crises, and I was wondering if you see population growth as a crisis.
Well, I would say population growth is a big contributor to the food crisis, to the water crisis, to the climate crisis. So I haven't enumerated it as a separate one, but it's definitely an underlying one. You can always discuss which ones of interconnected things do you highlight as a thing in itself and which is the underlying driver.
Niels, thank you for a wonderful talk. Let us not forget that energy is the theme of these meetings, and it is inextricably linked to, as you point out, all of these other issues. And so we will come back to that again next week when our final lecture of this semester series will take place about the California energy situation. But Niels, thank you very much for a wonderful talk.